So recently you may have seen some ads or posts highlighting forest truths here on social media and even on some billboards on Vancouver Island that read things like truth, BC will never run out of old growth forests, or truth, BC forests are 100% sustainable and renewable, which are some pretty bold statements to be printed out onto highway billboards. So this campaign is from the Truck Loggers Association, which is a group that represents independent logging contractors and workers throughout the forest industry here in BC. Now the TLA does some really great community work and advocacy for better forest practices like high retention and selective harvesting, especially in the private sector, as they mostly represent smaller businesses and individuals in the industry rather than the giant publicly traded conglomerates. Now, we're currently in the middle of a massive province-wide transition for the forest industry, fueled by public outcry on the dwindling health of both old growth and second growth forest ecosystems throughout the province. And as such, I can see that many in the industry might be going through some hard times right now. You know, funding has been cut, there's a lot of gray area around the future of working forests, and a lot of these folks are afraid that their livelihoods are in jeopardy. It's a scary thing for sure, and straight up, there needs to be way more support from our government for these businesses and workers as we as a society navigate through this transition. After all, we're always going to need wood products. You know, this isn't about ending logging, it's about doing it better. So unfortunately, many of these discussions though around old growth deferrals, there hasn't been much support made available for these communities despite the government promising to do so, which is totally cussed up, I know, but I've got to save that rant for a whole other video because I want to take a moment here to address these ads specifically, because not only were these billboards recently vandalized, but there's a lot going on here from a basic communication standpoint with the messaging that's pretty misleading, ultimately bringing up some larger implications for our future. So let's start by breaking down these two ads in particular whose issues both stem from the vague use of terms that tug on our tender little heartstrings that have been trained by trending emotional values. The broad statement of BC will never run out of old growth forests hits you right in the face. Poof, old growth forests, what, really? We'll never run out? Whew. You know, I was worried. But the actual truth of this statement comes down to the definitions of what one considers old growth to be. See, the definition the TLA is referring to here is the industry and government standard that defines old growth as few as one tree over a certain age based on its location, which is over 140 years in the interior and 250 years out here on the coast. Now, surely by going by this definition, we will always be able to have as few as one or maybe two, a couple standing trees that fit that criteria of over a certain age. I mean, heck, you know, just one more century to go and many of our second growth forests will be defined as old growth. But if we define old growth in the ecological sense as a wholly intact ecosystem that has evolved over numerous generations, then suddenly the truth of that statement begins to waver. See, old growth or primary forest consists of a rich mosaic of biodiversity of plants and trees that live to be well over 1,000 years old to then die and fall over to give the next generation of forest a head start above the forest floor, resulting in pit and mound topography and a diversity of species that performs numerous ecological functions, maturing into existence over 2,000 to 3,000 years. If that's how we define old growth, then suddenly it becomes a thing that we can't simply replant and replace in a few decades like our current industry assumes. Therefore, the statement of BC will never run out of old growth forests isn't necessarily a lie, but instead is just such a gross oversimplification that, you know, gets rid of all the nuances and comes across as deliberately misleading. I mean, honestly, if that statement were actually true, there wouldn't even be a need to say it because we wouldn't be in a situation where there's a need to reform the entire industry in order to protect the last of these forests. Then the broad statement of BC forests are 100% sustainable and renewable also comes down to misleading definitions using trending words like sustainable and renewable that strike us right in that emotional sweet spot as we've been trained to during this era of climate change. This statement is only true if we myopically define sustainable as the sustaining of jobs or economy and renewable as meaning that something grows back even if it is radically different from the original. If we look at expanding these definitions, then suddenly the statement falls apart entirely. While individual trees do grow back after being cut down, a healthy forest ecosystem as a whole simply does not, and certainly not in the time span that we allow them. So are these forests really renewable in the way that we're currently operating? From a biodiversity sense, when a rich, diverse ecosystem is destroyed and replaced with a mixed stand of even-aged and equally spaced trees, is that sustainable to biodiversity? How about when that same even-aged stand of second growth gets infected with an insect that loves that particular size, age, and type of tree, or when that tightly packed forest catches fire and spreads uncontrollably through its canopy to destroy homes and entire towns? Is that ecologically sustainable? Or when that diversity of big and small trees and rich understory that regulates the hydrological cycles of our forests to stabilize our soils and regulate runoff is lost, and we suffer from record-breaking floods that destroy our infrastructure, is that ecological dysfunctioning sustainable? Is that damage to infrastructure economically sustainable? What about when primary forests containing large western red cedars, traditionally used for hundreds if not thousands of different purposes by local indigenous nations, are logged and leveled to the ground so that they have nothing left? Is that culturally sustainable? Or even from a spiritual, societal, or psychological sense, when so many of us suffer from postpartum post-pandemic physical or mental health issues, is it spiritually, socially, or psychologically sustainable to continue to destroy healthy, intact ecosystems that have numerous proven health and community benefits? How about on the broader global sense during this era of climate change? Is it sustainable to continue cutting down some of the richest, densest stores of carbon left on this planet when up to 80% of that carbon is lost during the processing, and when replanting those forests can take up to 2 decades just to reach net zero emissions? The answer to all of these questions is a resounding no. None of the way that the industry is currently operating is sustainable to any other factor besides creating a somewhat consistent source of jobs and economic revenue, while also completely ignoring the economic cost of all those other issues it creates. While this statement might be somewhat true in the short-sighted sense of sustaining, economics of a broken industry model for a few more years, when we consider the ecological, environmental, cultural, social, psychological, and broader economic impacts of these industries' current operations altogether, it is clearly not sustainable in the way that we would like to define the term. And even then, is an industry that is wholly dependent on the destruction of these ecosystems to obtain high-value timbers as a means of offsetting its costs while also relying on $365 million annually in subsidies really even economically sustainable in the first place? So these billboards are part of a larger campaign called the 17 Forest Truths, which breaks down some pretty good information regarding the economics of the industry and our forests in an easy to digest way. Granted, there's a little bit of bias in the way that the information is presented, with some misleading visuals and charts and some cherry-picked data that's suggesting that there's much more of this controversial, big, healthy old growth remaining than there actually is. But all in all, it's a great resource for insight into the economics of the industry, which just reinforces the fact that these workers and businesses, especially the small privately owned ones, need more support and recognition through this transition. After all, there are many ways to do it better, and it's inspiring to see so many small businesses starting up, taking advantage of these new openings in the market. But I'm a bit disappointed by these billboards here because they seem to undermine these good intentions of the TLA by oversimplifying these messages in a way that is reminiscent of some really shady, misleading industry communications in the past. See, industry has been doing this for decades, from early propaganda driving settlers out west for logging jobs in the early 1900s to countless smear, slander, and misinformation campaigns through the timber wars and the war in the woods, and it points to a larger societal trend. See, I really do think that the Truck Loggers Association does have good intentions, especially for the longevity of those in the industry, and supporting these small, innovative businesses, mills, woodlots, and fallers that do good work in the woods is the direction we all should be heading. Yet looking into the origins of the TLA, we can see that the organization's board is made up of white people, predominantly old white males who all own businesses in the logging industry here in BC operating on stolen Indigenous land. In other words, this messaging is being funded by a small group of privileged shareholders who all stand to benefit financially from this industry system maintaining its status quo at the expense of all the unaccounted stakeholders that are negatively impacted by their actions. This is just an extension of that age-old capitalist colonist story on Turtle Island, where people with power, money, and vested interest in their own personal gains use that influence to fulfill their own interests at the expense of everyone else and their very own future. Where's the diversity, the innovation, the inclusion of other stakeholders, not only in representation, but engagement in these processes? Unfortunately, half-baked messages like these billboards echo too near the misinformation and slander campaigns from industry in the past, and efforts to mislead or sway the science and facts only detracts from the overall discussion and hinders any real constructive change that could actually create a better situation for us all. It's 2022, and people are not naive to the fact that big industries of all kinds have continually lied to their faces for decades, and as a result, people no longer trust or have faith in these industries to not act for their own immediate self-interest over that of the public good. The reality is that these are public forests on public lands managed both by public and private companies, and each one of us has a voice in how they're managed, as their health impacts our health and our future. This ultimately comes down to education and engagement, and the more informed we can all be, then the easier it's going to be for all of us to work together to create a way forward. We need to protect the few remaining old growth forests we have left, and instead create a sustainable second growth forest industry model that seeks to increase ecological function, carbon storage, and biodiversity, while also maintaining skilled workers and jobs that support our local communities, and doing all of that in a way that honors and respects Indigenous sovereignty over their very own lands. Greenwashing, misinformation, slander campaigns, and cherry-picked data does not work to rebuild the trust necessary to create a future we all deserve, and furthering the bickering among public stakeholders does nothing either. We all need to work together for this change, and unfortunately, the more resistance there is, the more difficult it's going to be for these businesses to adapt to the changes that are inevitably coming, and that will negatively impact not only those working in the industry, but all of us in the communities we live in. Sure would be refreshing to see some honesty and follow-through in a billboard that reads, "BC forests are in crisis, but we're working harder to do better." It's got a nice ring to it, huh? Because now that we know better, we can do better together.